Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ongoing Mastery Presenting and Speaking, the podcast. And today, the discussion about beliefs and debunking. Why on
Yes.
earth are we talking about that, Kelly?
Well, there are a few hoary chestnuts of myths that won't go away, despite later research that shows the original idea to not be accurate. So we thought we'd talk about them.
And there's also a few that I thought were fully debunked that it turns out it's complicated.
Yeah.
Uh, so one of the reasons why I asked Kelly to have this conversation today is because I encountered a lovely and brilliant way of handling debunked content that still has some value. I am following a instructor named Lucas Rookwood for Yoga Body. And he does these wonderful videos for stretching, especially if you tend to stiffen up really quickly. His videos are amazing. And he's a very good instructor. And snorer. So I have been looking at the mouth tape thing and trying to figure out if I should use it, and was using it and was resenting it, and saw he had a video on it. And in his video, he's talking about this breathing technique and mouth tape and this Dr. Pushenko and the valuable information he had. And then he said, "Why haven't you heard of him?" Well,
Mm.
that's because he and his students took his research a little far and made claims that weren't supported. But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean the original work isn't really useful.
Yep.
And I thought, oh, I need to use that from now on.
Yeah.
Because Kelly helped me learn some things that I believed were actually a little more nuanced. So what is your go-to, like, if someone's asking about a myth in in presenting and speaking, we talk about educators as well, and people who are teaching for a living, which is what we do.
Mhm.
What is one of your myths that just absolutely eats at your soul, Kelly?
The notion that everybody born after 1980 are digital natives.
They're not?
They're not, it turns out. Mark Prensky coined this term in a 2001 essay, and it's important to note that the essay was not a scientific paper presenting research or results or anything like that. Prensky is a technologist and a futurist and an essayist, author, thought leader,
I'm going
but
to
not
interrupt for a quick
scientist.
second. People who are not watching the video did not see how much I rolled my eyes, but you might have heard it. Sorry, keep going.
um, and he coined this term digital native to talk about people born after 1980, although he didn't use that date, it kind of got backdated, to think of this generation as a cohort that speaks a different language, that because of the way they use technology, their brains are wired a little differently. Technology lights up and reinforces some areas of the brain and doesn't work on, lets connections drop in other parts of the brain, was his argument. And by the way, you and I in this construct are digital immigrants because it's not our fault. We were born before 1980, and thus the technology that dominates the world now didn't yet exist.
Yeah, because so that's not insulting to actual immigrants at all. No, not at all.
It's widely seen as it's an unfortunate phrase, and it's
Yeah.
also ageist because the flip side of digital natives, everyone born since 1980 is tech savvy, is that anyone born before 1980 is tech illiterate. And that's not true on either end of the scale. I have students who use a wide variety of tech, but then can't use other pieces of tech very well at all. As
Mhm.
sophisticated as a student might be in, say, mixing music, can't find their way around the course management system, for example,
Yep.
right? And it's really a disservice to assume all students are tech savvy, fully digitally native. Therefore, I will just show them once how to do something and they shall have
And
it forevermore.
they'll just get it.
Right.
Yeah.
That is not true at all.
Yeah, there is no bippity boppity boo. There is no magic, you know. I used to say my least favorite was the butts and seats myth, that
Mm,
people coming to training, physical trainings, especially tech training, as long as they're in the room and they're sitting down, you know, that's fine. They get credit for attending. And it's like, yeah, their body's in the class. That doesn't mean their brain's in the class. That doesn't mean they're
yeah.
attending. Doesn't mean they're
No.
leaving with knowledge. But learning and development people will know exactly what I'm talking about. So mine is something that happens in the L&D field all the time, which is learning styles.
Hmm.
And you discovered my belief about learning styles in a notable way, didn't you?
Yeah, you were telling me how you'd met our third team member, Danny, and you'd been interviewing her for a position on a team in a previous company you were with, and bonded over your shared loathing that the learning styles myth wouldn't go away despite being debunked. It was quite an elegant rant.
Yes, it was. We were the L&D community is broken into distinct tribes, almost religious in their fervor, and I happen to be part of the tribe that's like, oh, for fuck's sake, just ugh. And here's why. When I was getting my master's degree, I was doing it online, and part of their content had learning styles in it. And I went and I wrote to the professor and I said, "Okay, you got to take this out because this was debunked. It's a preference, but it doesn't test out as you must teach this way in order for people to learn." And they said, "Well, we know, but the K to 12 people really, really lean into it, and it's important to them, so we leave it in." And I came back with the argument
Yeah.
of, okay, but as higher education, isn't it our duty? And I'm saying our, even though I was the student, I was like, our duty to actually, you know, show up and say, okay, there's a discussion about this. Let's expand the conversation and talk about the myth and the history and this and that. And I
Yeah.
didn't get anywhere, and I was pissed. So
Yeah, you were.
yeah. So here's the thing about learning styles. Learning styles is when you have somebody say, I am a X learner. I'm an auditory
Yep.
learner. I'm a physical or kinesthetic learner. I'm just, I have
Visual.
to hear, you know, I have to hear things. I have to see things. You know, that's the only way I really learn. And what has been proven out by testable science is that it is a very strong preference for people. So if you give them this information in their preferred modality, it is easier, but they are
Hmm.
still able to learn in all the ways their body can access. And what makes me nuts as an instructional designer is that it's a pointless conversation, because if you design for engagement, you're hitting all of that kind of stuff anyway,
Yeah.
and everybody benefits from increased engagement.
And
So
that's,
it's like,
yeah,
yeah,
that's just it. Switching up what you're doing in a classroom to move from, say, listening to a 15-minute conversation to moving around the room to relocate and talk in small groups to watching a video and then coming back together as a class or something like that. That's just good for engagement because it gets people's brains shifting their focus, it renews their attention, all of those things that you want for any class, even if learning styles were true, which they're not.
yeah, the reason why it persists is because it feels true. It and
Yeah.
it, you know, it's comfortable, and it makes sense to a certain degree that people would be like that. But we're actually much more complicated and nuanced, which brings me to our next point.
Yeah.
Uh, I had the strong belief up until last week.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I'm sorry. It's Friday. This week, that's how it's been. That a strong myth in the speaking world of power poses was fully debunked, and it's essentially crap, and you know, all of that. And then you and I started looking into it, and you shared research in which the answer is more complicated. It's actually more nuanced. And
Yep.
so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In 2012, Dr. Amy Cuddy did a TED Talk and it went viral. And that was the TED Talk that if you know power posing and have seen a TED Talk about it, that's the one, even if you don't recognize the name Amy Cuddy. Second most watched TED Talk, at least up until recently, maybe still. And that was the accumulation of research that she and others had done. And she's talking about power posing and the way in which it influences the speaker in terms of hormonal reactions and things like that, cortisol in the brain, things like that. And it's vastly oversimplified. And it fell into a trap of, in sociology, of replication crisis, it was called. Apparently, there was a period in which a whole lot of work in sociology was in this replication crisis. And I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not really familiar with why this was a sudden thing that kind of collected in the same time frame. But Cuddy's work fell in that time frame and was a particular example of replication crisis. Others couldn't produce her results. And more research happened, more studies. Amy Cuddy herself on the TEDx site, on her speaker bio page, has an update to her own talk and a conversation in which she says it's more complicated. Ultimately, she feels vindicated that there is an effect and that it does help the speaker, but there are two kinds of effects that she'd been promoting as one, and now it's more clearly sussed out as two. One of them hormonal, physical, and one of them sort of emotional well-being. I summarize generally here.
Mm-hmm.
And how the speaker feels, the emotional half, is totally valid. And if power posing makes you feel strong and confident, then you should power pose.
Yes.
But as for the effects of the brain, the jury is somewhat mixed on that side of the research. So it's not fully debunked. It's, as many things are, more complicated.
Yeah, and I really thought it was completely and utterly debunked. And then I think it's 2021, they redid some research and they found, some effects. And it was like, huh. And so maybe that's what will happen with learning styles is maybe we will find out there's ways in which we can trigger, deeper cognition and better long-term memory storage,
Or even if I like what I'm learning because it's in my preferred mode, I'll stay engaged for the parts that aren't as much my preferred mode, right? Thinking about that emotional parallel with power posing. I
yeah.
don't want to discount the importance of feeling good about what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's super important. If it makes you, if it works for you and it's not hurting anything, it's a good thing. I tend to get pretty religious about this stuff because back in the day when I was still in occupational therapy, I was in college and I was learning my craft. And I came home to mom, and my mother is a clinical psychologist, and she'd worked with the retarded population for decades and decades and decades. And she also worked with autistic, and like there was a big carryover. So I was learning about working with autistic kids, and I learned a technique in school and came home and went, oh, this is amazing. It's wonderful. Facilitated communication is this amazing thing. And you can reach out to kids and have kids who've been in institutions forever, who are profoundly impacted and physically unable to really communicate normally are able to talk to you. And she went, honey.
About that.
And being my mother, she walked over to her file cabinet and she pulled out a file that is thicker than several of my fingers together. It was like a solid inch and change. And she
Yeah.
said, come with me. And she pointed to the kitchen table, and I sat down, and she went thunk and dropped it and said, read this and
Yep.
then we'll talk. And she had
Mm-hmm.
pulled out all the information showing that it was the Ouija board effect. It was essentially, it felt true to the person doing it. And what facilitated communication is that the disabled person or the impacted person is their hand, is over a board to be able to communicate. And the other person's hand is resting on there, supporting them. And what happens is that person actually does micro communication and movement that they don't realize they're doing. So it feels like the other person's hand is actually doing this thing. and communicating and spelling out words when that's not actually what's happening.
Yeah.
And the real result is actually far creepier because people really believe they're talking to somebody who's actually not communicating with them. And I
Yeah.
was brokenhearted. And I've been really, really sus about things since. So
Yeah.
that's why we're having this conversation. How, Kelly, how does this tie into ongoing mastery for presenters and speakers? Like, in what ways is this a lesson for
Well,
everybody?
we need to re-examine our sacred cows. The things we learned when we were coming up in our trade or through our formal education, or we learned early in our career and have served us well or seem to have served us well all along, doesn't mean they're still holding water. And we need to be willing to take a look and read updated material and let it go, or rephrase, reframe. But we can't just keep repeating it 20, 30, 40 years out, because that's not how science works.
Yeah. And the thing about scientific discovery is it is not a bad thing to discover that you were wrong. That is
Sure.
actually not a crime, which I notice that it feels that way and it seems that way to a lot of the population when, oh, this person made this claim in science 10 years ago and now they're saying they recognize that it's not true. That's science.
Yeah.
Science evolves. We learn more and more. And some of the things that I believe to be absolutely true might be proven out over time because we learn more as we go. But that, so you have to be open to the change, which is really hard to do.
You have to
And
ask the question. If you're not asking the question, you won't know there's change out there.
yeah. And there is also being open to things that are honestly just fairy dust and more woo than is reasonable. Now, I admit I am a low woo tolerance person. I find a lot of the fairy dust and magic stuff to be eye rolling to the extreme. When I was in pediatrics in school, there was an awful lot of, oh, we need to do this with the children because it feels good and it's just so nice. And I was always like, okay, but can you bill it to Medicare? And what are the actual practical effects? Can you document them in the chart? I was
I
that
want to know the
person.
insurance code for fairy dust. I think that would be
Exactly.
really
What's the insurance
useful.
code? And it if those listening, if you see me at a conference, ask me about the magnetic therapy conference and magnets and what happened, because that's a story in itself. Um, yeah, I was not popular. So, but the funny thing is that there is stuff that I honestly think is just horse crap, and yet uh, I'm you know, I need to be open to changing my mind, which is not easy for me. But as someone who is working on my craft, I'm working on my ongoing mastery of my art. I'm going to have to be open to persuasion. Now, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the persuasion can be bad persuasion and it can be lazy and just, well, I say so. Well, that's not going to fly. It's like,
That's not
what's your
persuasion.
documentation for that? But still being open to it. So,
Yeah.
Kelly, final wrap up. What is your takeaway for everybody, that one thing you think that they could add to their ongoing mastery toolkit on
Take
this?
time to read.
Mm,
Identify the journals or magazines or professional associations that put out white papers, whatever's the relevant place where your profession, your craft breaks news. And make sure you read it on the regular, whatever that is. Maybe it's a quarterly publication, or maybe it's a weekly thing and you give it a quick skim of the headlines. But if you're not making a habit of reading, it's a lot easier to miss the news you need to know about that changes your thoughts about a particular sacred cow. So if you're reading regularly, you're more likely to be learning regularly. How
nice.
about you?
Mine is going to crack you up because mine
Okay.
is going to be that the gold is in the footnotes. And that, see, I knew, as Professor Kellie approves, if you really want to follow a subject,
yeah,
and you find something interesting, dive into the footnotes and follow those. Do the rabbit hole, because that's where the richness is.
mm-hmm.
And that's also where you'll discover how shallow things are, if they are. Because sometimes the footnotes, you're like, that's not what that says. Like, they're
Well, and I
making this
have to
claim.
say,
Yeah. Sorry.
as someone who writes and sometimes has footnotes are where this I really want to get in my piece, and my editor has said it's not part of the main point, so I'm putting it in a footnote because I want my readers to see it. And so it's really gratifying to go down those rabbit holes because they're quirky and fun sometimes, and they're maybe only tangentially related to the main topic. And sometimes they're amazingly important, but the footnotes cover a wide range of things.
And the reason why I bring up footnotes is because I'm one of the fans on YouTube. I'm a member of LawTube. I am a fan of some specific lawyers that have irreverent, mouthy, and just opinionated discussions about cases in pop culture. And one of my favorite people is Emily D. Baker, who has Coffee and Cursey Words.
Yes.
And she was reading a basically a response, a call and response document that had footnotes from the judge, and in which the judge was giving their color. And she
Yeah.
pointed out, because she has the experience, she's like, the judge is not happy because the judge can't say in the document proper, you're an idiot. But in the footnote, they
Yep.
can kind of go, had this been submitted correctly,
Right.
And so she was reading
Footnotes are
those
where
with,
you get tone.
yeah, exactly. And she was reading those with she has a soundboard, she has a screaming goat, she has a singing pickle. Check her out on YouTube. She's amazing. LawTube. Yes. So yeah, that's it. That's our episode for today.
All right.
Please, just on the socials, check in. What are your sacred cows? What kind of things are you tied into, and what are your areas that have screaming goats and singing pickles? We want to know. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.